Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy in September 2017. By early 2018, every single U.S. store was closing and 30,000 people were losing their jobs. But here is the question almost nobody asked at the time. The private equity firms that own Toys R Us had already been collecting fees from the company for over a decade. So did they lose money on this deal? Or did they walk away fine while the company they owned collapsed underneath them? The answer to that question is the key to understanding how private equity actually works. In 2005, a group of investment firms bought Toys R Us for $6.6 billion. Roughly $5 billion of that purchase price was borrowed money. And here is the part that surprises most people. That debt was not placed on the investment firms. It was placed directly on Toys R Us itself. The company that used to compete on price and selection now had to spend around $400 million every single year just paying interest on debt it did not choose to take on. That is money that never went into stores, never went into competing with Amazon, and never went into paying employees more. For 12 years, Toys R Us was fighting for survival while carrying a financial anchor someone else had tied to it. This single structure, called a leveraged buyout, explains almost everything about how private equity generates returns. Instead of paying $6.6 billion in cash, the buyers only put in around $1.3 billion of their own investor money. The rest was borrowed against the company. If Toys R Us had thrived, the buyers would have made an enormous return on a relatively small investment. Since it didn't, the company absorbed the damage. The buyer's equity investment was mostly wiped out. But that is only half the story, because losing money on the investment itself is not the same as losing money overall. To understand why, you need to know how a private equity firm actually gets paid, and there are three separate income streams, each collecting money in a different way. The first is called a management fee. When a firm raises money from investors like pension funds and university endowments, it typically charges around 2% of that committed capital every year from managing the fund. This fee gets paid whether the underlying companies succeed or fail. If a firm raises a $2 billion fund, that is roughly $40 million a year in fees alone, often before a single dollar of profit has been generated for investors. The second stream is called carried interest, and this is where the big fortunes get built. Once a fund eventually sells its companies, the firm typically keeps around 20% of the profits above an agreed return threshold, while the remaining 80% goes back to the original investors. The exact terms vary by fund, and some deals include clawback provisions that force firms to return money if later losses erase earlier gains. But in a strong fund, this 20% slice across dozens of companies is what has created some of the largest personal fortunes in modern finance. The third stream is the one most documentaries skip entirely and is arguably the most controversial. Once a private equity firm owns a company, it can charge that company additional fees for consulting, for arranging financing, even for advice on how to run its own operations. In plain terms, the new owner bills the business for the privilege of telling it what to do. Multiply that across an entire portfolio of companies, and you get a quiet, steady stream of income that exists completely separate from whether any individual company actually improves. Now go back to Toys R Us with that knowledge. The firms lost most of their original equity investment when the company finally collapsed. But across the 12 years they owned it, they had been collecting management fees and advisory fees the entire time. So while the investment on paper failed, the men running the deal had already been paid year after year, regardless of the outcome. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this entire industry. The fee income and the investment return are two completely different things, and a private equity firm can profit from the first even when it loses on the second. Which raises an obvious question. If the incentives work like this, why would any company want private equity ownership at all? Because sometimes the same playbook produces a genuine turnaround. Take Hilton Hotels. In 2007, right before the financial crisis, Blackstone bought Hilton in a deal valued at roughly $26 billion. The timing looked disastrous. The global economy crashed within a year, and hotel bookings collapsed worldwide. But instead of stripping the company down, Blackstone spent years restructuring Hilton's debt, expanding its franchise model, and improving how the company was run. When Blackstone eventually exited its investment years later, it had turned that $26 billion bet into one of the most profitable private equity deals in history, reportedly generating tens of billions of dollars for its investors. This is the version of the story private equity firms like to tell, and in this case, the evidence largely backs it up. So what actually separates a Hilton from a Toys are us. It usually comes down to three things. How much debt gets loaded onto the company relative to what it can realistically support? How much operational improvement the new owners actually bring versus how much they simply extract? And how much competitive pressure the company was already facing before private equity even arrived. Toys R Us was already losing ground to Walmart, Target, and Amazon before the buyout happened. The debt did not create that competition, but it likely removed the financial flexibility the company needed to fight back. This brings us to scale because none of this stays small. Private equity and related private capital funds now manage several trillion dollars globally, and that figure has grown enormously since the 1980s. Firms like Blackstone, KKR, and Carlyle no longer just buy retailers and hotel chains. They own apartment complexes, medical practices, veterinary clinics, and infrastructure most people never think about, from cell towers to water utilities. As these funds grow larger, so does the fee income attached to managing them, which is precisely why the industry keeps expanding into new corners of the economy, whether or not every individual deal succeeds. And that expansion has consequences that go beyond spreadsheets. Reporting on private equity ownership in healthcare, for example, has raised concerns in some cases about staffing cuts and cost pressures at hospitals and physician practices after acquisitions, prompting scrutiny from lawmakers and regulators. Similarly, private equity ownership of rental housing has drawn criticism in various markets over rent increases and fee structures. These are not universal outcomes across every deal, but they are documented patterns worth understanding if you're a patient, a tenant, or an employee at a company you didn't know had been bought out. So how do private equity firms actually make money? Through fees paid by investors regardless of performance. Through a share of the profits when a fund eventually sells its companies. And through additional fees charged directly to the businesses they own. Debt, when used aggressively, can multiply the returns on all three, but it also concentrates the risk onto the company and its employees, not onto the investment firm managing the deal. None of this makes private equity inherently good or bad. It makes it a tool, one capable of rebuilding a struggling hotel chain into one of the most successful turnarounds in modern business history, or quietly hollowing out a beloved toy retailer while the people who structured the deal had already been paid long before the final collapse. The outcome depends less on the industry itself and more on the specific choices made inside every single deal, choices that most customers, employees, and even investors rarely get to see until it's already too late.